At 6:40 on a Tuesday morning in Providence, Rhode Island, the number 14 city bus lost its brakes on the hill at Broad and Trinity and hit a utility pole hard enough to fold the front end inward. Fuel started leaking. A minute and a half later, the front of the bus was burning with 22 people still inside, and the nearest fire company was 9 minutes out. The only person close enough to matter was a woman asleep under the awning of a shuttered pharmacy across the street, beside a shopping cart that held everything she owned. Her name was Marlo Quinn. She was 26, and she hadn't had a hot meal in 2 days. She crossed 4 lanes of frozen asphalt barefoot, because she'd been sleeping with her boots as a pillow, and there wasn't time to put them on. She pried the rear emergency door open with a length of rebar from her cart, and she pulled out everyone who could still walk. Then she went back in for the last one, an elderly woman pinned in the 3rd row who wouldn't let go of a worn olive wood rosary. When the sirens got close, Marlo checked the woman's pulse, said one sentence to a newspaper vendor on the corner, and pushed her cart away down Trinity Street before anyone could ask her name. She had a reason. She always had a reason. What she didn't have was the faintest idea who that old woman was, or what it was going to cost her when the woman's son came looking. Because in Providence, there are certain families you don't want to do a favor for by accident. If stories like this one stay with you, give this video a like. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that the person with nothing is often the only one who knows what to do. And subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that corner. 11 minutes before the sirens. The iron bar tore free from the doorframe with a shriek, and the emergency exit burst open into the freezing air. Inside, smoke had gathered beneath the ceiling of the bus in a thick layer, pressing slowly downward like something searching for a place to settle. Marlo climbed inside, keeping low, and the first thing she did wasn't shout. She listened. There was coughing on the left, someone calling another person's name in the middle of the bus, and the sound of metal contracting in the heat near the front. 3 sources of sound, 3 directions, and she already knew where she had to begin. She had been taught this in a training room that smelled of antiseptic and had blue vinyl flooring, by a woman who stood at the back, with her arms folded, and repeated over and over that a person's first instinct was to run toward the loudest cry, and that instinct was almost always wrong. The person crying the loudest was still able to breathe. The person making no sound at all was the one you reached first. But the second rule was even more important than the first. And the second rule was that anyone who could walk had to leave first. Because every person who walked out on their own was one person you didn't have to carry. And every person you didn't have to carry meant more time for the person you had no choice but to carry. Marlo stood in the rear section with one hand gripping the side of a seat, and she began speaking in a voice that surprised even her, because it didn't shake. She told everyone to stay low beneath the smoke. She told anyone who could stand to get up and move toward the sound of her voice. She told them not to take their bags, not to take their coats, not to turn back for anything. A middle-aged man came out first, then 2 young women supporting each other, then a mother carrying a child with a teenage boy following behind her. Marlo stood at the edge of the doorway and counted each person silently, never aloud, only inside her head, because she knew that if she counted aloud, people would hear it and panic when the number stopped. She held out a hand for each person to grab, and the moment their feet touched the street, she let go, turned back inside, never looked after them, never waited for anyone to thank her. An old man in the middle section couldn't stand because of his knees, so she slipped her shoulder beneath his arm and lifted him, and he apologized the entire way to the door, apologized for being heavy, apologized for being slow, and she told him to stop talking and save his breath. The smoke sank lower. She had to drop all the way to her knees just to see. Every time she went back inside, her field of vision grew a little shorter, and she had already begun running her hands along the backs of the seats, just to know where she was inside the bus. She brought out the next person, then the one after that, and inside her head the count kept moving steadily and silently, like a clock she wasn't allowed to drop. Then came the moment when she went back in, and no one else stood up. She moved down the aisle, crouched low, tapping each seat back with her hand, calling out one short word at every row, and at the 3rd row from the front, a hand closed around her wrist. An elderly woman was sitting there with her back against the side of the bus, her left leg trapped beneath the frame of the seat in front, which had been driven backward when the front of the bus crumpled. She wasn't crying out. She only looked at Marlo with eyes that were startlingly clear, far clearer than anyone her age should have looked in a moment like this, and she was clutching something in her right hand so tightly that every knuckle had turned white. Marlo reached down, tried to push the seat frame upward once, then twice, and it didn't move. She changed position, braced one foot against the base, and on the third attempt, she managed to open a gap wide enough. But to pull the woman through that gap, she needed the woman to hold on to her with both hands, and one of those hands was occupied. "You have to put that down," Marlowe said. "No," the old woman replied, her voice impossibly calm. "My son gave it to me when he was little." Marlowe stopped for exactly one beat. Somewhere near the front of the bus, something cracked apart. "Then keep it," she said. "But your other hand has to hold on to my neck. Hold tight. Don't worry about hurting me." The old woman looked at her for another moment. "Can you do this, girl?" Marlowe didn't answer right away. She drew one short breath through clenched teeth, breathing air that no longer felt like air at all. And she thought about lying, then decided not to. "I don't know," she said, "but I won't let you go." The old woman's left hand tightened around her neck, and she held on hard enough that Marlowe knew she believed her. Marlowe lifted the seat frame one final time with her back instead of her arms, and the woman slid free, and both of them collapsed toward the aisle, and from that point on Marlowe never stood again. She crawled, dragging behind her a weight that seemed heavier with every yard. Her head kept low, breathing out more than she breathed in, counting seatbacks instead of steps. 7 seatbacks, 6, 4, and then the open doorway appeared ahead of her like a square of gray light, and the cold air from the street struck her chest, and in that moment she heard the first siren rising from the far end of the street. Marlowe laid the old woman on her side on the sidewalk, far enough from the bus to be safe, in a spot where a section of wall blocked the wind. She placed 2 fingers against the woman's neck, held them there for several seconds, and counted. The pulse was fast but steady, without the irregular rhythm Marlowe feared most. Her chest was still rising and falling. Her eyes were still open. Her right hand was still clenched around the thing she had refused to let go of, and Marlowe looked at that hand for a moment before pulling the edge of the woman's coat over it. The newspaper vendor from the corner had run over and was standing a few steps away, still holding the stack of morning papers he hadn't had time to put out. Marlowe looked up at him. "Don't let her sit up," she said. That was all she said. Then she stood and left. She didn't run, because people remembered someone who ran. She walked back toward the cart, still standing beneath the drugstore awning, bent down, took her shoes from the cloth bundle, and slipped them onto feet, so numb that she couldn't feel her skin touching the lining. Then she pushed the cart down Trinity Street before the first ambulance had even come to a stop. The reason fit neatly inside 3 pieces of paper folded into quarters in the inside pocket of her coat. 3 citations for violating public lodging ordinances, issued at 3 different locations during the same winter. 3 fines she hadn't paid a single dollar toward. She had learned long ago that papers like those didn't disappear. They only waited. They waited until the day someone typed her name into a computer, and the computer matched that name to those 3 citations. And then there would be a question, then a phone call, then a vehicle. She didn't have to do anything wrong for them to hold her. She only had to have her name attached to a report. And if her name appeared on the incident report that morning, even as the woman who had pulled more than 20 people out of a burning bus, then this Saturday there would be no one sitting in the orange plastic chair in the visitation room at the County Family Services office. Nell was coming this Saturday. Nell was living with a foster family on the north side of the city, in a house with a carport and a swing in the backyard. And Marlowe had stood on the opposite sidewalk and looked at that house exactly once, then never gone back, because she didn't want to become the kind of thing people had to keep an eye on. Her visitation request had been returned, then resubmitted, then postponed, then scheduled again, and finally there was one Saturday, 1 hour, and it was 4 days away. Nearly a year had passed since the last time she had seen her sister. She had waited almost a year. She wasn't going to trade that for her name in a newspaper. She pushed the cart all the way down Trinity Street, then turned into an alley behind a row of old warehouses, and there she stopped, leaned against the brick wall, and breathed. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold. This part she understood. This was only her body using up everything it had just borrowed, and it would pass in about 15 minutes. She stood there and let it pass, and while she stood there, she thought about another night, the night she never allowed herself to think about at any other time. That night she had been working the late shift at a warehouse outside the city, stacking boxes onto pallets, and her shift was supposed to end at 11 o'clock. But a shipment had arrived late, and the supervisor asked who wanted to stay because the extra hours would be paid at time and a half. and she had raised her hand because they were short on money for medication that month. She came home 2 hours late. Nell was asleep on the couch with the table lamp still on. Their mother was lying in her room, and she had already gone. No one knew exactly when, alone and quietly, sometime between the moment Marlowe raised her hand and the moment she opened the front door. After that, Marlowe never accepted another extra shift. Not because she was afraid, because she had learned something no one had ever taught her in school, that there are very small windows of time in a person's life, and you are either there during them or you aren't, and there is no way to go back and buy them again with anything. She straightened away from the wall. Her hands had stopped shaking. She pushed the cart out of the alley, and behind her, several blocks away, the sirens were still overlapping one another in the morning air. Less than 3 miles away, on the eastern side of Providence Harbor, there was a room in warehouse row number 7 where the lights had been on since before dawn. Inside were a wooden table, 3 chairs, and 2 men. The man sitting on one side of the table was Hollis Raddick, owner of a cargo handling subcontracting company, and he had been talking without pause for 20 minutes. He talked about the last quarter, about fuel prices, about a contract that should have been signed but had been withdrawn at the last minute. He talked about his wife. He said he only needed another 6 weeks, and he repeated the words 6 weeks 3 times, each time in a different tone, as though testing which version might sound more acceptable. The man sitting across from him didn't interrupt once. Salvatore Marchetti sat with his back straight, both hands resting on the table, and he listened to everything. It was a habit of his, and people often misunderstood it. They thought he listened because he was considering what they said. In truth, he listened because he believed that a man who was about to lose everything should at least be allowed to finish saying whatever he needed to say, and because Sal had already made his decision the previous Thursday. When Raddick finally stopped to breathe, Sal opened the leather briefcase beside his chair, took out a stapled packet of papers, and placed it on the table, turning it so the words faced Raddick. "Read it," he said. Raddick looked down. It was the employee roster from his own company. Full names, positions, years of service, and in the last column on the right was the name of another company beside the same start date. He turned to the second page. Then the third. His hands began to shake on the third page. "I found new jobs for every one of your people last week," Sal said. His voice didn't rise at all. "Every company on that list is decent. Every one of them pays more than you do, and everyone has already signed the contracts. Monday morning, you won't have anyone left to pay. You don't owe me any more. You won't have anything left to owe." Raddick looked up, his mouth opened, then closed. He said something very softly, perhaps a name, perhaps a plea. It was impossible to tell because the sound wasn't strong enough to cross the space between them. Sal stood. He said nothing else. He didn't explain that the company had paid its workers late 3 separate times, while continuing to cover every other obligation in full, and he didn't mention that one of the workers on that list had called his office the previous month, and that phone call was the reason the list existed at all. He didn't explain because he saw no reason to make what he had just done sound kinder than it was. He picked up his briefcase, buttoned his coat from top to bottom, and walked toward the door. Behind him, Hollis Raddick collapsed forward over the table, his shoulders folding inward, while the papers remained exactly where Sal had left them. Outside, the wind coming off the bay blew up the concrete slope, carrying the smell of engine oil and salt water. Sal stopped for several seconds at the top of the steps. The thumb of his right hand touched the hardened callus at the joint of his middle finger, rubbed it twice in a small circle, then stopped. It was a habit so old that he no longer knew he had it. The driver had already opened the car door. Sal hadn't even reached the bottom step when the phone inside his coat vibrated. He looked at the screen. June Whitaker was calling before 7 o'clock in the morning, and June Whitaker never called before 7 unless something had happened that couldn't be handled by text. He answered. He didn't say hello. He only raised the phone to his ear and waited. "Boss," June said, and from that single word he heard immediately that something was wrong. She continued slowly and clearly, in the way of someone who had rehearsed the sentence several times before making the call. "She's at Rhode Island Hospital. She took the bus this morning, and it crashed at the corner of Broad and Trinity. She's conscious. They say she has a broken leg and minor burns on her forearm. Other than that, she's all right." Sal stood motionless on the concrete steps with the wind striking one side of his face. He didn't ask her to repeat herself. He said nothing for about 3 seconds. And during those 3 seconds, June barely dared to breathe on the other end, because she had worked for him long enough to know that this man's silences were never empty. "Which bus?" he asked. "Route 14, June replied. He nodded once to himself, then walked down the final 2 steps. "Call Beckwith," he said. "Tell him to cancel my entire morning." Then he ended the call, got into the car, and the door closed behind him with a soft, solid sound, and the car left the harbor, heading back toward the city as the sky began to brighten. Antonella Marchetti was lying on the 4th floor, in the last room at the end of the hallway, her left leg already in a cast, and her right forearm wrapped in gauze. The doctor said she had a closed fracture of the fibula, a superficial burn, and aside from those 2 things, a 68-year-old woman who had just come out of a burning bus was showing better vital signs than most of the healthy people walking through that hallway. Sal stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. It had taken him 25 minutes to get there from the harbor, and during those 25 minutes, he hadn't asked the driver a single question, hadn't opened his phone, hadn't called anyone else. He had simply sat there. Now he walked in, pulled a chair close to the bed, and sat down. "Ma," he said. Antonella turned her head. Her eyes were open and alert, and the first thing she said wasn't about her leg, wasn't about the bus, wasn't about whether she had been frightened. "Deirdre, you have to find her," she said. Sal looked at his mother. "Find who?" Sal asked. "The girl who pulled me out." She spoke slowly, one word at a time, like someone afraid she might be interrupted before she could finish. "I don't know her name. She didn't tell me. She didn't wait for anyone to come. She put me down on the sidewalk and then she disappeared." Sal nodded. "I'll find her," he said. "I'll make sure she's properly rewarded." Antonella went quiet. Then she raised the hand that wasn't bandaged, placed it on her son's wrist, and squeezed once, not hard, but firmly enough to stop him. "Salvatore," she said, "I didn't tell you to repay her. I told you to find her." Silence settled over the room. Outside in the hallway, the wheels of a cart rolled past and gradually faded away. Sal didn't pull his hand back. "What's the difference?" he asked, and he meant it. He wasn't arguing. Antonella looked up at the ceiling for a moment. "There is one," she said. "If you repay her, you're finished. If you find her, you have to know who she is." Sal sat still. "What do you remember about her?" he asked. The old woman thought. "I couldn't see her face clearly," she said. "It was dark in there, and I could only see what was right in front of me. She was young. Her voice was low. She wasn't panicking." She paused. "She wasn't panicking at all. Do you understand? I've been through funerals, hospitals, enough terrible things in my life, and I know the difference between the voice of someone trying to sound calm and the voice of someone who truly is calm. That girl was the second kind." Then she continued, and this time her voice changed. "I remember one thing. When we reached the door, she reached out to help me down, and her sleeve slid up. I saw something right here." Antonella pointed to the inside of her wrist, just beneath the base of her hand. A small marking, 3 dots in a row, and a letter. The letter R. Sal looked at the place his mother was indicating. "Printed or handwritten?" he asked. "Handwritten," she answered immediately. "The lines weren't even. It looked like someone had done it themselves, not like something another person had made for her." He stored that detail in his mind without taking out his phone, without writing anything down. He had a good memory for things like this, and he had learned long ago that anything written down was something another person could read. "Anything else, Ma?" Antonella was silent longer this time. Then she spoke, and her voice no longer carried the same certainty it had when she described the marking. "I've met her somewhere before." Sal's brow tightened slightly. "Are you sure?" "No," she answered plainly. "I'm not sure. It's only a feeling. When she bent down and told me not to worry about hurting her, I had the feeling I'd heard that voice somewhere before. Not once. Many times. Somewhere I used to go regularly." She gave a small shake of her head. "But I can't remember where. I'm old, Salvatore. Some things are still inside my head, but they refuse to come out." Sal sat quietly beside the bed. Outside the window, morning had fully arrived, the thin white light of February falling across one corner of the floor. "I'll find her," he said. "I know you will," Antonella replied. "But I'm telling you one thing now." She turned her head fully and looked at her son. "When you find her, don't do that thing you do." Sal didn't ask what she meant by that thing he did. He only sat with her a little longer, then stood, pulled the blanket higher over his mother's shoulders, and stepped into the hallway to call June. The meeting had been scheduled 2 weeks earlier, and Sal didn't move it. 7 o'clock that evening, Ferrante's restaurant on Atwell Street, and everyone went down the narrow staircase behind the kitchen, through the wine cellar, and into the low-ceilinged room the family had been using since his grandfather's time. There was a long table in the room with 7 men seated around it, the youngest already past 40, the oldest having sat at that table since before Sal could walk. No one brought a phone downstairs. It was the only rule that had survived intact from his father's time. Sal sat at the head of the table, opened his briefcase, and skipped the introduction. "Beginning next month," he said, "we shut down the entire short-term lending operation. No new contracts. The loans already running get collected according to the existing schedule. No penalties, no extensions. By the end of the quarter, we close the books." No one said anything for about 5 seconds. Then a chair scraped backward from the table. Rocco Vitali stood. He was 61 years old, and had sat at Sal's father's right hand for nearly 30 years. And when he rose, everyone at the table turned to look, because if there was one man in that room who had earned the right to stand, it was him. "Do you know how many people that business feeds?" Rocco asked. "I know," Sal replied. "Do you know what you're cutting away?" "I know." Rocco placed both hands on the table. "Your old man never would have signed this." The sentence fell into the middle of the table and stayed there. Someone near the far end cleared his throat, then stopped. Sal didn't answer immediately. He closed the papers in front of him, pushed them aside, then stood and walked around the table, slowly, without hurry, and when he reached Rocco, he stopped behind him and placed one hand on the older man's shoulder. Then he leaned down and spoke quietly enough that everyone in the room had to hold their breath to hear. "Uncle Rocco, my father died on a prison transport with a breathing tube down his throat, and not one man sitting in this room came to his funeral because every one of you was afraid of the cameras." No one moved. Rocco didn't turn around. His shoulder hardened beneath Sal's hand, then slowly loosened. Sal straightened. He didn't remove his hand from Rocco's shoulder. He looked down the full length of the table, at every face one by one, faces he had known since childhood, men who had carried him in their arms, given him spending money, stood at the back of the church during his first communion. "I'm asking every one of you one question," he said. His voice was ordinary, no louder than before. 20 years from now, do you want your children sitting in this chair or sitting in a courtroom?" No one answered. One man in the middle of the table looked down at his hands. The man beside him turned his glass of water once, then left it still. Sal continued, "I'm not asking to make anyone uncomfortable. I'm asking because I've been working this out for almost 2 years, and I haven't been doing the math alone. Lending is the easiest thing we do, and it's also the thing that puts people in prison fastest. It doesn't collapse because of prosecutors. It collapses because one day someone borrows more than he can repay, and that man has a child, and that child grows old enough to report what happened." He paused. "I'm not planning to rebuild anything. I'm planning to take it apart piece by piece, slowly, legally, and I'm planning to do it while everyone in this room is still alive and still has work to do. Anyone who wants out can leave now. I'll settle everything in full, no questions asked. But anyone who stays has to understand that from this point forward, we move in only one direction." He squeezed Rocco's shoulder once, then let go, returned to his seat, and sat down. "Anyone else have something to say?" he asked. Silence. The silence lasted long enough to become the answer. Rocco Vitali sat back down in his chair. He didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting, but when Sal moved to the next item, Rocco was the first to nod, and the other men watched that nod before giving their own. The meeting ended close to 9 o'clock. They went upstairs one at a time through the narrow staircase, several minutes apart, the way they always did. Sal stayed behind until everyone else was gone. He sat alone in the low-ceilinged room with the long table empty before him, and he thought about his mother lying on the 4th floor of Rhode Island Hospital with one leg in a cast, and about a young woman who didn't panic, who had 3 dots and the letter R on the inside of her wrist, who had laid his mother down on the sidewalk and disappeared without leaving anything behind. Sal started where anyone with money would start, and within 2 days, he discovered that money couldn't buy what he needed. The fire department's incident report was 4 pages long, and in those 4 pages the girl appeared exactly once, on the 3rd line of the supplemental notes, in these exact words. "An unidentified woman assisted with evacuation before emergency personnel arrived." No description, no age, No identifying features. Sal read that line 3 times, then set the paper down. He was accustomed to systems recording too much about people. So accustomed to it that his entire life had been a series of efforts to keep his own name from being written down anywhere. But this was the first time he had encountered someone the system hadn't even bothered to record. No address meant no file. No file meant nothing to search. She had pulled more than 20 people out of a burning bus, and the city had acknowledged it with the words "unidentified woman." He had people ask at the hospitals. Nothing. They asked at the 2 largest shelters, and the staff said they didn't provide information about anyone staying there, and Sal recognized that as the right answer, so he didn't push. He had someone stand at the corner of Broad and Trinity for 3 mornings in a row. The newspaper vendor remembered a girl, remembered the cart, but not her face, and he said plainly that even if he did remember her face, he wouldn't admit it, because people often came looking for women like that, and usually not to thank them. June Whitaker was the one who suggested the other direction. If they couldn't trace the person, she said, then trace the marking. She had it redrawn from Antonella's description. 3 dots in a row and an uneven handwritten letter R, printed several dozen copies, and went out. Over 4 days she visited every tattoo shop in the city, and several more in Pawtucket. At one of the later shops, an elderly owner picked up the drawing, held it farther from his eyes, tilted it, then handed it back. "This wasn't done in a shop," he said. "How can you tell?" "No outline," he replied. "The ink bleeds out on both sides of the marks. Here, look at this part. Sewing needle and ballpoint ink. Someone did it themselves, 1 puncture at a time. Took hours, and hurt a lot more than you'd think." June looked at the drawing. Why would anyone do that? The old tattoo artist gave a very slight shrug. "I've been doing this a long time," he said, "and I've seen people do things like this when they're afraid they're going to forget a name." That was the detail June brought back, and it was also the detail that left Sal sitting silently at his desk for a long time that evening. They found her at the end of the 2nd week, and it wasn't because of the tattoo. One of Enzo's men had a sister who volunteered in a soup kitchen, and she said there had been a young woman lately who often left a cart in the vacant lot behind St. Anselm Church. Sal went alone. He told the driver to park a block away, and walked in carrying an envelope. The lot was empty except for a few plastic bins and a brick wall that blocked the wind, and she was sitting there with her back against the wall, a paperback open across her knees. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, gave him one complete look from head to toe, and Sal understood immediately that she had finished reading him before he had even opened his mouth. "You're the one who pulled my mother out of that bus last Tuesday morning," he said. Marlowe neither confirmed nor denied it. She closed the book and set it beside her. "My name is Salvatore Marchetti," he continued. "My mother's name is Antonella. She's recovering well." He held out the envelope. She didn't take it. She didn't even look at it. She looked straight into his face. "You think I pulled her out for that?" she said. "I don't think that," Sal replied. "Then why did you bring it?" He stood there with the envelope in his hand, and in that moment he realized he had no prepared answer, something that almost never happened to him. "I don't know another way," he said. Marlowe stood, brushed her hands against the legs of her pants, and reached for the handle of the cart. "Then go learn one," she said. Then she pushed the cart out of the lot, past him without hurrying or slowing, and never looked back once. Sal remained standing there until the sound of the wheels rolling over gravel disappeared at the end of the alley. He was still holding the envelope. It had been many years since anyone had turned their back on him while he was still speaking, and he stood there waiting for the familiar feeling to rise, that cold, precise sensation he always felt when someone dismissed him. But it didn't come. Instead, he felt something entirely different, something it took him a while to name. And when he finally did, he didn't like the name very much. He felt ashamed. The invitation didn't come from Sal. It came from his mother, through a handwritten note that June brought to the vacant lot behind St. Anselm Church 3 days later, and there was only one sentence on it, saying that she was the old woman from the 3rd row, and she wanted to invite Marlowe to dinner, not to thank her, just to have dinner. Marlowe read the note twice, then asked June whether anyone would get in trouble if she didn't come. June said no. Marlowe said, "Then let me think about it." She came on Friday night. Dinner was served in the kitchen instead of the dining room, exactly as Antonella wanted, and she sat at the head of the table with her leg in a cast resting on a low stool. At first the conversation came in scattered pieces. Then Antonella reached for the pill bottle on the shelf and struggled with the cap, and Marlo stood to help her, and when she read the label, she paused for a beat. "How long have you been taking this dose?" she asked. "Since I was in the hospital," Antonella replied. Marlo turned the bottle over, looked at the back, then set it down. "Are you also taking the blood pressure medication in the morning?" "Yes." "Then you should ask your doctor about this again. Taking these two together can make your blood pressure drop when you stand up, and you're walking on crutches. Have you been getting dizzy when you stand from a chair?" Antonella looked at her for a moment, then said yes. Sal sat across the table and said nothing, but he had stopped eating. He remembered that 3 days earlier his mother had nearly fallen in the hallway and had said the crutch caught on the rug. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. Marlo sat back down. "I studied nursing," she said. 3.5 years. Nothing more. She didn't say why it had only been 3.5 years. Sal didn't ask, and that was probably the only correct decision he made during that entire dinner. At the end of the meal, after Antonella had gone upstairs, he finally brought up what he had meant to discuss from the beginning. "There's a community clinic in the Riverside district," he said. "My family funds part of it. They're short an intake coordinator, someone who works at the first desk and decides who needs to be seen first, who can wait, and who needs to be sent straight to the hospital." Marlo didn't answer. Sal continued. "It's a real job. They've been looking for someone for 4 months. Salary, health insurance, and they'll guarantee a lease for you." "No," Marlo said. Sal looked up. She didn't say anything else right away. She sat quietly for a moment, with both hands resting on the table, then spoke in an even voice. "I know you think you're giving me an opportunity, but I accepted something like this once before, and the price wasn't in the part I could see when I took it, so the answer is no." Sal nodded once. He didn't argue. He stood, got her coat, said that if she changed her mind she could tell June, then walked her to the door. 3 days later she called, not to accept the job, to set conditions. They met in the Marchetti living room one morning, with Beckwith sitting beside them with a blank pad of paper, and Marlo gave 3 terms, one at a time, clearly, like someone who had been writing them in her head for 3 nights. First, no one at the clinic was to know that she had once slept on the street, not because she was ashamed, she said, but because the first day someone knew, everything she did there would be measured by a different standard, and she couldn't work under that standard. Second, if she couldn't do the job, she would leave, and no one was to make excuses for her. No one was to call anyone to keep her there. Third, the contract had to state clearly in writing that her work existed only within the clinic and had no connection whatsoever to any other activity of the family, in any form. Beckwith wrote down all 3. Sal signed all 3. It should have ended there, but it didn't, because 2 weeks later, Marlo discovered something. She went to the city office to ask about her 3 old citations, and they told her that all 3 fines had been paid in full on the 9th, with receipts, and the name of the lawyer who had submitted the payment. That afternoon she went to Sal's office. She didn't sit down. "You paid those 3 fines," she said. "Beckwith handled it," Sal replied. "Is there a problem?" "Yes. Deduct it from my pay." Sal put down his pen. "Miss Quinn, that amount isn't worth talking about." "Not to you," Marlo said. "It is to me. You don't understand. All my life people have paid small things for me, and every time they did, I owed a little more. And eventually that pile of little debts became so heavy I couldn't stand up straight anymore. I'm not letting that happen here." Sal was about to say that he didn't consider it a debt. He opened his mouth and immediately realized how meaningless that sentence was, because the question had never been what he considered it. "I'm not negotiating this," Marlo said. "You deduct it, or I quit." He looked at her for a moment, then he picked up his pen, wrote a line in the margin of the papers in front of him, and called Human Resources while she was still standing there so she could hear him say it. "Deduct it gradually," he said into the phone. "A portion from every paycheck until it's paid in full. Put it in the record." He ended the call. Marlo nodded once, said thank you, then walked out. And when the door closed behind her, Sal remained sitting alone and thought that in 20 years, no one had ever walked into that room and demanded the right to owe him more. Marlo had been working at the Riverside Community Clinic for 6 weeks when people began to notice something, although it took a little longer before anyone put it into words. The wait at intake had been cut almost in half, and no one had changed the process. No one had hired more staff. No one had bought another computer. The only thing that had changed was the way people were called. Before, full names had been announced over the speaker, and Marlowe had stopped that in her second week. She gave each person a plastic card with a number, and when it was their turn, she walked over and spoke quietly to them, or she held up a small board with their number on it. The clinic manager asked her why. Marlowe said there were people who walked through those doors, carrying a name they didn't want spoken aloud in front of 20 strangers, because that name existed in some file somewhere, or because someone was looking for them, or simply because they had spent the entire morning gathering enough courage to walk through the door, and didn't have enough courage left to hear their name called across a room. People don't leave because the wait is too long, she said. They leave because they feel watched. The second thing everyone at the clinic came to know was that she remembered. She remembered who was taking which medication, who had a follow-up appointment the next week, who had come 3 times and left all 3 times before their turn. For that third kind of person, she saved the first appointment of the morning, when the waiting room was still nearly empty. During those 6 weeks, she also filed a petition to regain guardianship of Nell. She wrote the petition herself, submitted it herself, sat across from the social worker for 45 minutes by herself, and answered every question without asking anyone to come with her. They told her the case would be reviewed, that now that she had steady employment and legal housing, things were very different from before. She wrote the appointment date on the back of a plastic number card and kept it in her pocket. On Thursday afternoon of the 7th week, Antonella Marchetti came to the clinic. She had stopped using crutches and moved on to a cane, and she was there to collect the results of another scan, and she had arrived late. So by the time she finished, the waiting room had nearly emptied. She stood in the hallway waiting for the driver to bring the car around, and from where she stood, she could see directly into the waiting room. Marlowe was inside alone, cleaning up. She pulled the rows of plastic chairs away from the wall, gathered them together, then began stacking them. But she didn't stack them the way people usually did. She turned the second chair upside down over the first, legs against legs. Then the third went upright, the fourth upside down, alternating each one so the stack rose higher without tipping and took up less than a corner of the wall. Antonella went still. She didn't remember the face. She had told her son she hadn't been able to see the girl's face clearly through the smoke, and that had been true. But she remembered the movement. She had seen that exact movement, that exact rhythm of alternating chairs, in the room behind St. Anselm Church, where she had gone to cook every Thursday for more than 10 years. After every meal, when everyone had gone and the women in the kitchen were wiping down the tables, there was always a young woman who stayed behind to stack the chairs. No one asked her. No one paid her. The girl came through 2 winters, ate there, stayed to stack the chairs, and then one winter she simply stopped coming. Antonella had asked about her once, and no one knew her name. She stood in the hallway with one hand resting on the top of her cane, and she didn't go inside. She didn't call out. She watched until the final stack of chairs was finished, then turned toward the door. That evening she told her son. Sal was sitting at the dining table with a file open in front of him, and he closed it when she began to speak. She told him about the 2 winters at the soup kitchen, about the way the chairs were stacked, about standing in the hallway that afternoon and watching for several minutes, and that she was certain. Sal remained silent for a long time. "When did you recognize her?" he asked. "This afternoon," Antonella replied. "Before that, it was only a feeling. I told you I had a feeling." Sal looked at his mother. "Are you going to tell her?" "No," she said immediately. "Not yet." He waited. Antonella placed both hands on the table. "I've kept quiet this long because I wanted her to take this job because she deserved it," she said. "Not because I owed her. If I'd told her from the beginning, everything she did there would have carried the smell of repayment, and that girl would have smelled it before either you or I did." She paused for a moment. "Let her finish 6 months first. Then I'll tell her." Sal nodded. He asked nothing else. But that night, after his mother had gone upstairs, he remained sitting alone downstairs for a very long time, and what he thought about wasn't the soup kitchen or those 2 winters. What he thought about was the 3 dots and the letter R that no one had yet been able to explain. In a 9th-floor office overlooking the river, Corbin Doyle read the summary of the previous quarter's bidding results and said nothing for a long while. 3 harbor contracts, 3 losses, and all 3 had gone to a cleanly registered company with Marchetti behind it. The assistant stood, waiting for instructions. Doyle set the paper down, turned his chair toward the window, and said only one sentence. Men don't fall because of their enemies, he said. Men fall because of the thing they've only just begun to care about. The article appeared on the Providence Ledger website on Tuesday morning under the headline, "The Boss and the Girl Beneath the Awning." It ran 12 paragraphs, and in those 12 paragraphs there wasn't a single fact that was false. There had been a bus accident. An unhoused woman had helped evacuate passengers. One of those passengers had been the mother of Salvatore Marchetti. A position at a clinic partly funded by the Marchetti family had been given to that same woman less than a month later. Every part of it was true. But the facts were arranged in an order that invited readers to reach a conclusion the writer never had to state, and the phrase personal relationship appeared 4 times in 12 paragraphs. In the 5th paragraph, the article printed her full name. Sal read it at 7:15 and called Marlo at 7:17, before she had even looked at her phone. She was standing at a bus stop on her way to work. "There's an article in the Ledger this morning," he said, "about the clinic and about how you got the job there. Nothing in it is factually wrong, but the way it's written isn't kind. I wanted you to hear it from me before someone sent it to you." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Marlo spoke. "What do you need me to do?" Sal stopped. He had prepared himself for several different reactions, and that wasn't one of them. "Nothing," he said. "I'm handling it. I only wanted you to know." "All right," she said. "Then I'm going to work." She ended the call. Sal remained sitting there with the phone in his hand, thinking that he had just been asked a question no one had asked him in a very long time, and the person asking it was the one being dragged into the newspapers. Doyle needed nothing more than her name. Everything else could be bought, and he bought it within 8 days. St. Coleman Hospital on the west side of the city had an archive of old personnel records, and inside that archive was a disciplinary file from many years earlier involving a student intern named Quinn, accused of falsifying the controlled medication log in a way that had led to a death in the geriatric ward. The file had signatures, dates, and a formal finding, and it had never been destroyed. Doyle didn't send it to the press. He didn't send it to the court either. He sent it to the social worker handling Nell Quinn's guardianship case, along with a short, exceedingly polite handwritten letter expressing concern that a minor might be placed in the custody of someone who had once been formally disciplined for medical misconduct, and expressing confidence that the agency would review the matter thoroughly in the child's best interests. The letter was signed, "Concerned Citizen." There was no return address. The social worker was a decent person, and precisely because she was decent, she had no choice. When information related to the safety of a child in temporary care reached her, she was legally required to forward it to family court within 72 hours. She did. The notice arrived at the clinic on Friday afternoon, on paper, by certified mail, in 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph stated that the guardianship case identified above was being temporarily placed on hold pending review of newly received information. The second stated that scheduled visitation was suspended until further notice. The third stated that the applicant had the right to submit a written response. Marlo was standing at the intake desk when she opened the envelope. The waiting room was crowded that day, with 7 or 8 people seated, children making noise in one corner, and an old man coughing. She read all 3 paragraphs. Then she read the second paragraph one more time. After that, she folded the paper in half, folded it into quarters, slipped it into the left pocket of her shirt, and smoothed the crease flat with her thumb. She looked up at the number screen. She picked up the small number board, stepped out from behind the desk, walked over to the woman sitting in the second row, and quietly told her that it was her turn and that she could go into the room on the right. Then Marlo returned to the desk and kept working until the end of her shift. She came to Sal's office on Monday evening after work, and she didn't wait for anyone to invite her to sit. She placed the notice, folded into quarters, on the desk, smoothed it flat, and pushed it toward him. He read all 3 paragraphs, then looked up. "What did they receive?" he asked. "A disciplinary file from St. Coleman Hospital," Marlo said. "From when I was still doing my clinical training. You should hear it from me before you read it, because what it says is accurate, and it's still wrong." She sat down. She sat straight with both hands resting in her lap, and she began speaking in a voice he would remember for a very long time afterward, the flat, steady voice of someone reading back a report she had memorized. She said that during the final year of her program, she had been assigned to the night shift in the geriatric ward. She said there was an elderly woman in the room at the end of the hallway who was receiving palliative care, and she had been prescribed a fixed dose of injectable pain medication. She said that for 3 nights in a row, The woman showed no relief after the injections, even though, according to the pharmacology, she should have. And on the third night, Marlowe took one of the medication vials from the cabinet and examined it. The concentration was wrong, she said. Someone had removed part of the medication and replaced it with saline. She continued by saying that the next morning, she did exactly what she had been taught to do in school. She wrote an incident report, recorded the lot number, the times, her clinical observations, and submitted it to her direct supervisor, the head nurse on the night shift. She turned it in on Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, she had been called into Human Resources. I thought they wanted to ask me more questions, she said. But they called me in to tell me the case had already been decided. Sal sat still. That head nurse was the cousin of someone on the hospital board, Marlowe said. I didn't know that until I was sitting in Human Resources. And I also didn't know that the date on my report had been changed by 1 day. So it looked as though I wrote it after the woman died instead of before. The woman died Saturday night. Marlowe stopped for exactly 1 beat, then continued. She died in pain she should never have had to endure. That was the only sentence she said about it. And she gave no further description. The hospital needed a name to close the file, she said. They couldn't let it become a case of diluted medication causing a death, because then it became criminal. It became the press. It became the state inspectors. But they could make it a documentation error by a student intern. That stayed internal. That could be finished in 1 afternoon. They offered me an agreement. I would admit to an administrative error, withdraw from the program voluntarily, waive any appeal, and they would pay me a settlement. Sal asked only one question during the entire conversation. Did you have a lawyer? No, she said. I was 20. I didn't know I was allowed to have one. She looked down at her hands, then raised her eyes again. My mother was in final stage treatment at the time, she said. Insurance only covered what was on the approved list. Everything outside that list came up short every month, and every month I had to decide what we were going to go without. The amount they offered me covered exactly 4 months of medication. She was silent for a while. I signed, she said. I signed in Human Resources on Friday afternoon, walked out of the hospital at 4 o'clock, and went home to make dinner. Sal said nothing. My mother died 4 months later, Marlowe said. Just that one sentence. Nothing more. He let the silence remain between them for a while. Then he spoke slowly, and he didn't mean for it to sound like an accusation, but it came out that way anyway. You sold your name. Marlowe looked directly at him. I bought my mother 4 months, she said. Then she said the second sentence, and it was the second sentence that made him look away. And if someone put that same paper in front of me now, I'd still sign it. That's the part that keeps me awake. Not that they pressured me. I can be angry about that, and anger is easy to live with. What's hard to live with is knowing I wasn't really forced. I was given a choice, and I chose, and I would make exactly the same choice again. Sal sat for a very long time in the room, which had gone completely dark without either of them turning on another light. Finally, he asked what the old woman's name had been. Marlowe said she couldn't remember the last name exactly, only the first name. She told him the name, and Sal wrote it on a small piece of paper without thinking much about it, because at that moment it was only a name from someone else's old story. He folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket. 3 days later, at his own dining table, he would take it out and read it aloud to his mother. He told his mother on Thursday evening at the dining table, after she had taken her medication and before she went upstairs. He told her briefly, without adding or leaving anything out, that people were using an old file to block Marlowe's guardianship petition, that the file said she had falsified a medication log, and that the truth was the exact opposite. Antonella listened with her hands resting on the table. That old woman? She asked. The woman in the hospital? Do you know her name? Sal took the small piece of paper from his coat pocket. He unfolded it and read. Rosaria, he said. Antonella went completely still. Rosaria Fenwick, she whispered. There was a silence that he would later remember with exact clarity, even how long it lasted. His mother said nothing. She looked down at the table. Then she pushed herself to her feet with both hands, reached for her cane, and walked into the next room. Sal remained seated, and he heard a drawer open, paper rustling, then the sound of her cane returning. She placed a small framed photograph on the table in front of him. In the picture, 2 young women stood outside the gates of a textile mill, scarves tied around their hair, their arms around each other's shoulders. His mother was on the left, so young that Sal had to look twice before he recognized her. "Who is this?" he asked, though he already knew. "She wasn't family," Antonella said. "You wouldn't remember her. She came to the house a few times when you were little, then stopped." She was quiet for a moment before continuing, and when she did, she spoke with the voice of someone slowly opening something that had been sealed shut for a very long time. "Before your father, I had another husband. I left him. Back then, when a woman left her husband, there was nowhere for her to go. No one wanted to take her in because they were afraid of getting involved. Rosaria let me stay with her for 2 years. She hid me in the room behind her house, found me work at the mill, lied to everyone who came asking questions. She did that for 2 years, and she never took a cent from me, and she never told anyone until the day she died." Sal sat without moving. Antonella continued, and her voice began to change. "I was with her on her last night," she said. "I sat in the chair beside her bed all night. She was in pain. They gave her an injection, but she was still in pain. I went into the hallway and asked the nurse why she was still hurting after they gave her the medicine, and she told me Rosaria's body had grown used to it, that at that stage, the medicine simply didn't work anymore." She stopped. "I believed her," she said. "I believed that all these years. I went home and even told people how fortunate Rosaria had been to have a hospital take such good care of her." Sal didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Antonella pushed the photograph aside and looked up at her son. "Call that girl here," she said. "Now." Marlo arrived close to 9 o'clock. She was still wearing her clinic uniform, having come straight from work, and she entered the kitchen with the expression of someone who had no idea why she had been summoned. Antonella told her to sit. Then she pushed the framed photograph across the table toward her. "Look at the woman on the right," she said. Marlo picked up the frame. She looked at it for a very long time. Then she set it down, and her hand wasn't entirely steady when she did. "She was your friend?" she said softly. "She was the woman who saved me," Antonella said. Then she added, slowly, "And she spent that entire last night in pain. And they told me it was natural, and I believed them." Marlo didn't answer. Antonella reached across the table. She took Marlo's left wrist, turned it palm upward, and looked down at the thin skin just beneath the base of her hand, where 3 small dots sat in a row beside an uneven handwritten letter. "When did you make this?" she asked. "The day they gave me the papers to sign," Marlo said. Antonella couldn't say anything after that. She didn't let go. She held that wrist between both of her hands, lowered her head, and stayed that way for a very long time, longer than anyone in that kitchen knew what to do with. Sal stood leaning against the doorway and didn't step inside. And in that silence, Marlo cried. She made no sound. She didn't raise a hand to cover her face. She only sat still and let the tears run down. The tears of someone who had hidden something somewhere inside herself for so long that she had forgotten she was still carrying it, and now someone had finally called it by its right name. No one said a word until she had caught her breath again. Then Antonella released her wrist and spoke in her ordinary voice once more. "I visit her every Tuesday. The cemetery is on the south side. I take Route 14. 9 days after that night in the Marchetti kitchen, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the fire alarm went off in the warehouse behind the Riverside Community Clinic, and no one heard it because the entire block had been closed since 9 that evening. The fire department arrived within 15 minutes and managed to contain the blaze before it spread to the main building. No one was inside. No one was hurt, but that warehouse held all of the clinic's paper records, files that had never been digitized because there had never been enough funding, records belonging to patients with no insurance, no social security number, nothing except a thin folder showing when they had come in and what medication they had been given. It was also where the clinic stored 3 months of reserve medication. By morning, there was nothing left. Marlo arrived at 4 o'clock. She walked there from where she was staying, called no one, and by the time she arrived, the firefighters were already rolling up their hoses. She stood at the edge of the sidewalk for a while, staring at the blackened doorway of the warehouse. Then she sat down. She sat directly on the sidewalk among patches of half-melted snow mixed with ash. Her arms wrapped around her knees, and she didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't call anyone. Sal arrived at 4:20. He had just come from a late meeting, still wearing his overcoat over his suit. He got out of the car, walked over, and didn't ask whether she was all right. He didn't say he would rebuild it. He didn't say anything at all. He sat down on the sidewalk beside her, right there on the same strip of dirty snow, and leaned back on both hands. They sat that way for 40 minutes. Neither of them said a word. His car remained parked at the curb with its taillights glowing, and June Whitaker sat in the front seat watching them for all 40 minutes. Close to 5 o'clock, Marlo stood, brushed off her hands, and said she needed to go inside and see whether anything could still be saved. Sal stood too. He didn't go in with her. He returned to the car, and on the drive home he didn't say a single word to June. He had no proof. That was the most important fact, and also the one he refused to let himself think about during the next 10 days. The fire department said the investigation into the cause would take at least a month. Sal didn't wait a month. In 10 days, he did 3 things. He bought the bank debt of Corbin Doyle's 3 closest subcontractors, 3 companies that had been doing business with Doyle since the previous generation, and he called all 3 debts at once, entirely within the law, entirely within the contracts, without a single comma out of place. He raised the lease rates on 2 harbor facilities Doyle was using to 4 times their previous amount when the contracts came up for renewal. He pulled every shipping order from the company run by Doyle's brother-in-law and transferred them elsewhere in a single afternoon. Beckwith sat across from him at the desk on the 8th day and read through the summary. When he finished, he set it down. "Do you know how many people work for those 3 companies?" he asked. Sal was signing another stack of papers. He didn't look up. "More than 200, Beckwith said. 200 people who have nothing to do with this. They just go to work and collect a paycheck." "I know," Sal said. "Anything else?" Beckwith looked at him for a moment, then picked up the papers and walked out. Marlo was standing in the hallway outside the door. She had come to deliver a list of medications the clinic urgently needed replaced, and she had been standing there long enough. She waited until Beckwith was gone before knocking. Sal looked up. She placed the list on his desk, but she didn't leave. "Do you know who you sounded like last night?" she said. Sal put down his pen. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't pretend not to understand. "Yes," he said. "My father." Marlo stood still. "And you did it anyway," she said. "I did," he replied. Neither of them said anything else. She looked at him for another moment, and there was no condemnation in that look, which was what unsettled him most, because condemnation was something he knew how to fight. Then she turned to leave. At the doorway, she stopped. "I don't know whether someone set that warehouse on fire," she said, "but I know one thing for certain. Neither do you." Then she walked out. Sal remained alone with the medication list on the desk and the unfinished contracts beside it, and for about 10 minutes he did nothing at all. Then he picked up the pen and finished signing. The fire department's investigation report arrived earlier than expected, on a Wednesday morning, and it was exactly 1.5 pages long. The cause of the fire was determined to be an electrical short in an old junction box at the southeast corner of the warehouse, where the wiring had exceeded its service life, the insulation had deteriorated, and poor contact had developed under high humidity. There was no trace of an accelerant, no sign of forced entry. No one had been behind it. Sal read the report at his desk, and he read the entire thing twice, and when he finished the second time, he remained sitting in exactly the same position for a long while. During the previous 10 days, he had called in the debts of 3 companies, raised the lease rates on 2 harbor facilities, and stripped every order from a transportation company. He had done all of it because of anger, and that anger had been standing on something that had never existed. He told no one about the report. He folded it and placed it in the top drawer. On Friday morning, a man came to the Riverside Community Clinic. He didn't register to see a doctor. He stood at the intake desk holding his hat in both hands, and he remained there for a while before speaking, the way a man does when he has to gather momentum before saying something difficult. Marlo asked what he needed. He said he wasn't sick. He said someone had told him the clinic gave out emergency food assistance vouchers to families who were struggling, and he wanted to know how the process worked. Marlo took out the form. "Where are you working?" she asked, because there was a section for that. The man tightened his grip on the hat slightly. "I drive for a subcontractor at the harbor," he said. "Last week I still had a job. This week I don't." Marlo stopped writing. "They said some man higher up called in the debt," he continued. "The whole company shut down in 3 days. I don't know who he is. I don't really understand what happened. I worked there 9 years. I drove trucks. I had nothing to do with their money or paperwork." He stopped. Then he added one more sentence, and he said it in the ordinary voice of someone mentioning some small thing that had happened at home. All I know is my daughter asked me why we couldn't buy her new shoes for school this year. Marlo said nothing. She didn't explain. She didn't say that she knew who that man higher up was. Didn't say that she worked for him. Didn't say a single thing to make the moment easier for either of them. She took a blank sheet of paper from the drawer, placed it in front of her, and picked up a pen. "Give me your full name," she said. He did. She wrote it down. "Phone number." He gave it. She wrote that down too. "How many people are in your household?" He said 4. Himself, his wife, and their 2 children. She wrote that down as well. Then she gave him the food assistance form, showed him how to fill it out, pointed out where to submit it, and thanked him for coming in. He put his hat back on and left. Marlo folded the blank sheet with the handwritten name in half and slipped it into her pocket. That evening she went to Sal's office. He was still there, the desk lamp on, a file open in front of him. He looked up when she entered. She walked to the desk, took the paper from her pocket, unfolded it, smoothed it flat, and placed it in front of him. She didn't say a word. She didn't look at him and wait for a reaction. She set the paper down, turned around, walked out, and closed the door very softly behind her. Sal looked at the paper. 1 name, 1 phone number, and the number 4. Slanted handwriting, firm strokes, written in blue ballpoint ink. He didn't pick it up. He simply sat there looking at it. And he remained that way for so long that the hallway lights outside switched themselves off on their timer. Inside his head, there was no argument left to hold on to. He had thought through every argument during the past 10 days, and he knew exactly how each one sounded when spoken aloud. And now all of those arguments were standing beside a piece of paper with 1 name and the number 4 on it, and not one of them could bear the weight. He didn't call Marlo. He didn't send her a message. The next morning, at 7 o'clock, he called Beckwith. "Are you awake?" he said. Beckwith said he was. "Make a list," Sal said. "Every employee from those 3 companies. Names, number of dependents, length of employment, previous wages. The transportation company, too. Everyone." Beckwith was silent for several seconds on the other end. "What for?" he asked. "I'm paying them," Sal said. "From the month they lost their jobs until they find new ones. And find them work. Do exactly what I did for Radek's people. No announcement, no press conference. No one is to know where the money came from." Beckwith asked one final question, whether Sal intended to tell anyone that he had been wrong. Sal looked at the piece of paper, still lying exactly where Marlo had left it the night before. "No," he said. "I intend to pay for it." The technical report on Route 14 was released at the end of the month, later than usual because they had to wait for an independent inspection, and Beckwith brought a copy to Sal's house himself one Saturday afternoon. The conclusion was on page 9. The air brake system had failed because the exhaust valve assembly had gone far beyond its required replacement date. Under regulations, that valve assembly should have been replaced nearly a year earlier. The city fleet maintenance records contained a form confirming that the work had been done, complete with a date, a technician's signature, and a part number. But when investigators compared it with the purchasing records, that part had never been bought. It hadn't been purchased and installed incorrectly. It hadn't been purchased and forgotten in a warehouse. It had never been purchased at all. Beckwith turned to the next page and pointed to the final section. The company contracted by the city to maintain the fleet was privately owned, and its ownership chain passed through 2 intermediary entities before ending at a trust whose ultimate beneficiary was Corbin Doyle. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone, Beckwith said. He was skimming money from a public contract, signing false parts invoices, pocketing the difference, doing it for years across multiple vehicles, always betting that nothing would ever happen. Sal read page 9 3 times. Then he asked Beckwith one question. "Where are we on the deal?" Beckwith was silent for a beat before answering, because he knew exactly what Sal meant. Since the previous autumn, Sal had been negotiating to acquire that same maintenance company, one of several smaller businesses he was gathering to rebuild the legitimate side of the family's operations. The transfer had already passed due diligence. All that remained was the signature. "If you'd signed 2 weeks earlier," Beckwith said slowly, "then on the day of the accident, the owner legally responsible for that fleet would have been you." Sal stood, took the report, and went down to the garage. He stood there alone beneath the fluorescent lights, read page 9 one more time, and there was only one sentence repeating inside his head, that if the signature had been completed 14 days earlier, his name would have been on the records of the bus that had nearly killed his mother. He punched the car door once. Then he stood motionless for a very long time. The thumb of his right hand touched the hardened callus at the joint of his middle finger, rubbed it twice in a small circle, then stopped. That night he went to Corbin Doyle's house. He went alone, left the car a block away, and entered through the back door, which was usually left unlocked because the neighbor's dog had a habit of wandering over. He sat in the armchair in the corner of the living room without turning on a light, without touching anything, and waited. He sat there for 2 hours. Close to 2 o'clock in the morning, a car pulled into the driveway. Keys sounded at the door, and Doyle walked inside and reached for the light switch. He saw Sal and froze in the middle of the room, with one hand still on the switch. Sal didn't stand. He didn't change position. "I've been sitting here for 2 hours," he said, trying to decide whether I should go back to being the man you still think I am. Doyle couldn't say anything. "I just decided," Sal said. "You're luckier than you know." Then he stood, walked past him, went out through the front door, and never looked back. He reached home close to 4 o'clock in the morning. The kitchen light was still on. Marlo was sitting at the table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she looked up when he came in. She looked at him once from head to toe, and she didn't need to ask where he had been. "You went to see him," she said. "Yeah," Sal replied. "What did you do?" "Nothing." Marlo looked at him. "What did you want to do?" There was a long silence. Sal stood in the middle of the kitchen with his coat still on, looking down at the floor, and he let the silence stretch as far as it needed to. Then he answered, "Everything." Marlo stood. She took a glass from the cabinet, turned on the faucet, filled it with water, and placed it on the table across from him. Then she sat back down. "I slept on the street for 3 winters," she said. "You think I've never met a man who wanted to do everything?" Sal didn't answer. "The only difference," she said, "is that you came home and said it out loud." He pulled out a chair and sat down. He picked up the glass of water but didn't drink. His right hand rested on the table, the knuckles swollen, and the skin split in 2 places. Marlo saw it, but she didn't say anything, and she didn't get up to find anything for it, because she understood that if she did, he would pull his hand away. They sat that way until the sky outside the window began to turn gray. Then Marlo left for work. Around 6 o'clock, Antonella came down to the kitchen and found her son still sitting in the same place. She looked at his hand. She didn't ask. She went to get the old metal first aid box that had been sitting on top of the refrigerator for as long as anyone could remember, pulled a chair beside him, drew his hand toward her, and cleaned it, wiped it, and wrapped each knuckle one at a time, slowly and carefully, exactly the way she had when he was a little boy. She didn't say a word. Neither did he. The name Bernadette Ostrom was on the 4th line of the list of people who had signed the findings report that year, and Marlo had remembered that name all this time without ever once trying to find her. She found her in 2 evenings through the faculty directory of a community college in Vermont, where Bernadette taught professional ethics to first-year students. Marlo didn't tell Sal. She took 1 day off, bought a long-distance bus ticket, and went alone early in the morning, sitting by the window the entire way north. Bernadette Ostrom opened the door and recognized her before Marlo had time to introduce herself. She didn't look surprised. She only stood there for a moment, then stepped back to let her in. "I've been waiting for you for a long time," she said. "I thought you'd come sooner." They sat at the kitchen table for nearly 4 hours. Ostrom said she had read the original incident report, that she knew the submission date had been altered, that she had said so during the meeting, and no one had entered it into the minutes. She said she had signed anyway, and after signing, she worked another 11 months before leaving medicine entirely, not because anyone forced her out, but because she couldn't bear standing beside a patient's bed with that signature sitting somewhere in her own record. At the end of the meeting, she said she would give a sworn statement. Beckwith drafted it in 2 days, and Ostrom signed it before a notary on Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Beckwith called Marlo into his office, and he didn't circle around the point. "There's something I have to tell you," he said. "Mrs. Ostrom signed a confidentiality agreement with St. Coleman that same year, and there was a payment attached to it. It wasn't a small amount. The penalty clause for violating the agreement is on page 3, and it's enough for them to sue for the entire amount back, plus interest, plus legal fees." Marlo asked what that meant. "It means if she testifies," he said, "she loses the house she's living in, and very likely the portion of her retirement savings she put into it." Beckwith placed the sworn statement on the desk. "The other side isn't stupid," he said. "The moment they brought out that old file, they knew you'd go looking for the people who signed it. They were waiting for you there." Marlowe looked at the papers on the desk. She had spent 7 hours on a bus to get them. They were the only thing she had that might reopen Nell's guardianship case. She picked them up. Then she tore them in half, then into quarters, and placed the pieces back on the desk. Beckwith didn't stop her. He only sat there and watched her do it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Marlowe said she needed the list of patients who had been admitted to the geriatric ward during that week. Beckwith told her most of the records had been destroyed under the retention schedule, but the admission list still existed, and he could obtain it. There were 8 people, including Rosaria. 3 had died. That left 5, plus 2 family members listed as caregivers. 7 people Marlowe could try to reach. She spent 10 days going from one to the next, after work and on her days off. The first person closed the door when she mentioned the hospital. The second listened to everything but said it had been too long ago and she didn't remember anything, and she said it in the way of someone who remembered perfectly. The third said she didn't want to get involved in a lawsuit at her age. The fourth was the son of a patient who had died, and he told her plainly that his family had closed that chapter and he didn't want to open it again. The fifth agreed to meet, then canceled. The sixth listened until Marlowe finished, stayed silent for a very long time on the other end of the phone, then said, "I'm sorry. I have young grandchildren. I can't do it." 6 people refused. The 7th was a man in his 80s, a retired mechanic who lived alone in a ground-floor apartment on the west side of the city. He invited her inside, poured her a glass of water, and listened to her from beginning to end without interrupting once. When she finished, he sat quietly looking down at his hands. "I was in pain that night too," he said. Marlowe looked up. "They gave me an injection, but I was still hurting," he said. "I pressed the call button. The nurse came in and told me old people didn't tolerate pain as well, that I just had to endure it. I thought it was because I was old." He stopped. "All these years, I've blamed myself for complaining that night." He signed his own sworn statement the next morning before a notary, and he didn't ask to review a single condition first. 3 days later, Bernadette Ostrom called Marlowe. She had heard what happened from Beckwith. "You tore it up," she said. Marlowe said yes. "Why?" "Because you already paid once," Marlowe replied. "I'm not going to make you pay again just so I can have peace." There was a long silence on the phone. Then Ostrom said she would testify, that she had called her lawyer the night before, and that she wasn't doing it for Marlowe, but because for all those years she had been waiting for someone who wouldn't force her. The man came on a Tuesday evening without an appointment, and he sat waiting in the hallway outside the office for nearly an hour before June brought him in. He introduced himself as Wendell Pryor, an accountant at Apex Property Group, and he placed a hard drive on the desk before sitting down. On that drive were copies of the detailed ledgers from the company that maintained the city's vehicle fleet, false purchase orders for parts that had never been bought, accounting entries showing the difference transferred through 2 intermediary entities, and reconciliations comparing what the city had paid with what had actually been spent over many years. Sal asked why he had brought it here instead of going directly to the authorities. Pryor said he had gone to a lawyer 3 weeks earlier, and she had told him that copies from one person alone, without anyone on the inside willing to confirm them, would make it very difficult to open a formal investigation, and that he needed someone with enough resources to keep the whole thing from being big. The formal interview was scheduled for 8 o'clock Friday morning. At 11 o'clock Thursday night, Sal's phone vibrated. It was Pryor. His voice on the other end sounded like someone who had just finished crying and was trying to speak normally. "I can't do it," he said. "I'm sorry. I'm not coming tomorrow." Sal sat up in the darkness and asked why. Pryor was silent for a moment, then said, "My wife has end-stage kidney failure. She's on the transplant waiting list. Her insurance comes through the group plan at my company. Someone called me this afternoon and reminded me of that." He said nothing more. He didn't need to. If he lost his job, the group coverage ended. And if the group coverage ended, then during the time it took to secure new insurance, his wife would fall outside coverage for the most expensive and most necessary parts of her treatment. Sal said, "All right, I understand," and ended the call. Then he turned on the light and looked at the clock. 6 hours remained. He didn't call Beckwith to ask whether there was a way to postpone the interview. He didn't call anyone to ask what they were supposed to do now. He did the one thing he was truly good at, the one thing his entire life had trained him to do. until he could do it without hesitation, which was to use whatever he had in his hands to build an outcome before morning came. By 5 o'clock, it was done. Wendell Pryor's wife had a new health insurance policy, purchased through the benefits program of the legitimate transportation company, bearing the Marchetti name, the highest level plan, with no waiting period for pre-existing conditions, the entire first year's premium already paid, and a clause preserving transplant waiting list coverage stated clearly in Section 4. The documents were complete. All that remained was the beneficiary's signature. At 6 o'clock that morning, Sal parked in the lot outside Pryor's apartment building and called him. Pryor came down wearing the same clothes from the day before, his eyes red, his hands empty. Sal handed him an envelope. Pryor opened it, read the papers, and had to read them twice before he understood what he was holding. He looked up. "When did you do this?" "Last night," Sal said. "Listen until I'm finished." He pointed to the policy in Pryor's hands. "You don't owe him any more," he said. "But I don't want you owing me either. So that policy is in your wife's name, not yours. It isn't tied to your job, it isn't tied to my company, and it isn't tied to any condition. It has been active since midnight." Pryor looked at him. "That means you can turn around and leave right now," Sal said. "You can get in your car, go home, not show up at the Attorney General's office, and never say another word about any of this. She keeps the insurance. No one can take it back from her." The parking lot was silent. Somewhere on the next street, a garbage truck passed. Pryor stood there holding the policy in his hands without moving, and when he finally spoke, his voice broke on the first word. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "You could force me. You could tell me that if I don't show up, you'll cancel it." "I know," Sal said. "Then why don't you?" Sal looked toward the far end of the parking lot for a moment, then turned back. "Because not long ago, someone placed a piece of paper on my desk with a name written on it by hand," he said. "And I sat there looking at it all night." He opened the car door. 8 o'clock, he said. "If you come, I'll meet you there. If you don't, that's all right too." Then he got into the car and drove away. At 7:45 that morning, Wendell Pryor walked into the lobby of the State Attorney General's office with the hard drive in his coat pocket, 15 minutes early for the appointment. Wendell Pryor's testimony opened a door that no one in that room that day had imagined would be so wide. Within 9 days, the State Attorney General's office referred the case to federal authorities because the city fleet maintenance contract included federal funding through an urban transportation infrastructure program. And once federal money was involved, everything changed its name. Beckwith came to Sal's house on Monday evening carrying a thick stack of papers, and he didn't begin with any explanation. He placed it on the table and told Sal to start reading from page 1. It was a risk assessment. It said that if Sal agreed to cooperate fully, provide every document, and open the books of the related entities to establish the ownership chain behind the maintenance company, federal prosecutors would have grounds to pursue Doyle at the highest level. It also said that once Sal opened the books of those entities, he couldn't open only half of them. The audit would trace backward, from one company to the next, through the years before he was involved and through the years when he was. Beckwith turned to page 17 and tapped one finger against a table. "This is the list of assets that could potentially be subject to forfeiture," he said. "Read all of it." Sal read from the top down. 2 companies. Most of the assets held under the old entities. Harbor facilities. Shares. He read slowly, skipping nothing. And near the bottom of the page, he stopped. The address of the house he was sitting in. The house where his mother had lived for nearly her entire life. Beckwith said nothing. He let Sal look at that line for as long as he needed. Finally, Sal asked what the chances were, and Beckwith said he didn't know, that it depended on how the other side's lawyers evaluated the source of the money used to purchase the property all those years ago, and that he wasn't going to lie to Sal by inventing a number. "But it's on the list," he said. "I had to tell you that." Sal told his mother the following evening. She was in the kitchen. He told her everything, softening nothing, including the line near the bottom of page 17. Antonella listened from beginning to end without interrupting him once. When he finished, she said nothing. She rose from her chair, walked to the sink with the help of her cane, turned on the water and washed her hands, then took down the cutting board, picked an onion from the basket, and began slicing it. Sal remained seated at the table. The knife struck the board in a steady rhythm. "Ma," he said. She didn't turn around. "You're asking whether I agree," she said. "Yes," he replied. She kept cutting. She didn't stop her hands, didn't turn her head, didn't look at him even once. "Salvatore," she said, "I've lived in this house nearly my whole life, and I haven't slept well in it for a single night." The knife stopped for one beat, then continued. "Take it away," she said. "I want to sleep." Sal sat motionless. She swept the onions into the pan, and the oil erupted in a hiss that drowned out everything else in the kitchen for about 10 seconds. And during those 10 seconds, he didn't move. Then she reached for the salt and added, still without turning around, her voice as ordinary as though they were discussing groceries. "I can move anywhere. I only need a kitchen and a window that looks out at something." He stood. He walked to the sink and stopped beside his mother, and because he didn't know what to do with his hands, he picked up the basket of onions and moved it out of the way. Antonella glanced at him once, then looked back down at the pan. "Eat here before you go," she said. He called Beckwith at 9 o'clock that evening, and the prosecutors at 9:15, and the second call lasted 4 minutes. That night, he sat for a very long time in the upstairs study with the desk lamp on and Beckwith's papers open to page 17. He had spent nearly 20 years protecting the things on that list. From the time he was very young, he had been taught that keeping something meant winning and losing it meant defeat, and no one had ever taught him any other way to calculate the difference. He looked at the line bearing the address of the house and thought about the woman downstairs washing the pan. The woman who had slept beneath that roof for nearly an entire lifetime without a single peaceful night, and he realized that all those years he had believed he was protecting something, when in truth, he had only been preserving it exactly as it had always been. He closed the papers and turned off the light. The investigation began in the second week of March, and in the third week, June Whitaker knocked on the office door at 7 o'clock in the morning, before Sal had even taken off his coat. She placed an envelope on the desk and didn't sit down. "This contains everything I've passed to Doyle over the last 4 years, she said. "Your schedule, your appointment list, the names of the people you were negotiating with, when you bought the maintenance company, and Marlowe Quinn's name back in February. I stopped in March." Sal didn't touch the envelope. He looked at her. June stood straight with both arms at her sides, and she didn't avoid his eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. "Why did you stop?" he asked. "Because of the night the clinic warehouse burned," she said. "I was sitting in the car. You sat down on the sidewalk beside her in that dirty snow, wearing that suit, and you stayed there in silence for 40 minutes. You didn't say a word. You didn't make promises. You just sat there." She paused. "My father used to say, a decent person is someone who knows how to sit quietly with another person's pain. I sat in that car that night, and I hated that you were doing exactly that." Sal asked who her father was. "Ellis Whitaker," she said. "He drove container trucks at the harbor. There was a shipment he was ordered to move, and he refused. And the man who gave the order was your father. After that, he couldn't get work at any harbor in 3 states. No one ever told him why. They just shook their heads. He sold the house in the 2nd year. He died of a heart attack in a rented apartment at 51. I was 19 when he died." She stood quietly for a moment. "I came to work for you 4 years ago with one intention," she said. "But I stayed too long. I sat outside this office for 4 years and watched you take apart, piece by piece, the thing your father built, and I kept sending information to Doyle anyway, because if I stopped, I'd have to admit that the man I wanted revenge on no longer existed. That's everything. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm only here to tell you before the investigators find out." Sal sat down. He picked up the envelope, opened it, and read everything inside, page by page, skipping nothing, while June remained standing there. It took him nearly 20 minutes. When he finished, he stacked the pages neatly and placed them on the left side of the desk. Then he opened the bottom drawer on the right and took out a gray file with worn corners. He opened it, turned to a page containing a list, rotated the file, and pushed it toward her. "Read it," he said. June stepped forward. The page contained a list of names, more than a dozen lines, each one showing a name, year of birth, occupation, the year the person had been blacklisted, and a column showing the status of the search for surviving family members. On the 9th line was Ellis Whitaker. The final column was blank. "I made this 2 years ago," Sal said. "After I found my father's ledger in the safe at the restaurant, he wrote down every person he'd ever caused to lose a job, carefully, like he was keeping inventory. I had people search for the relatives of every one of them. 11 families have already received restitution. There are 3 families we still haven't found. He pointed to the 9th line. You stood 12 steps away from me, he said, for 4 years, and I had people searching for you across 3 states. June couldn't speak. She stood staring at her father's name on the page, one hand gripping the edge of the desk to steady herself. Sal closed the file and pushed it toward her. Take this home, he said. Beckwith will contact you sometime this week. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to sign anything. You don't have to thank anyone. He paused. As for the other matter, you go to the investigators yourself today, before they come asking about you. That's the only thing I'm asking. June picked up the file with both hands. She reached the door and stopped, but she didn't turn around, and Sal didn't call after her. The door closed. Corbin Doyle was indicted in the middle of April on 14 counts, including fraud involving a federally funded contract. He didn't spend long in court, because his lawyers negotiated a guilty plea soon after Pryor's testimony, and the statements of 3 other former employees entered the record. Apex Property Group ceased operations within 2 months. As for Sal, the federal audit continued for nearly the rest of that year. 2 companies were shut down. Most of the assets held by the old entities were seized. He managed to keep 3 things: the clinic, the transportation company, and his mother's house. The last one because of a money transfer receipt from the 1970s that Antonella had kept inside a cookie tin. During the final 3 months of that period, the office was nearly empty. People left one by one. Everyone had a reason, and no one was blamed. Enzo Palmieri stayed. He was the man who had argued with Sal more loudly than anyone else in the basement room. The man who had opposed turning the records over to federal authorities until the very last moment, and he stayed for 3 months without pay and never said a word to anyone about it. In the 3rd month, when Sal handed him a check to make up the lost wages, Enzo looked at it and pushed it back. I still think you're wrong, he said, but you're my boss. The family court review was scheduled for a Wednesday morning near the end of May, in a small conference room on the 2nd floor of the County Family Services building, with a round table, 3 chairs for adults, and 1 chair for a child. Present were the social worker assigned to the case, a court representative, and Marlowe. Nell Quinn, 9 years old, entered last with the woman from her foster family, carrying a backpack. They asked her a few ordinary questions first: what grade she was in, whether she had a favorite subject, and she answered each one clearly, without hesitation. Then the social worker asked the main question, where she would want to live if she were allowed to choose. Nell opened her backpack. She took out a sheet of graph paper torn from a school notebook, folded into quarters, and opened it, smoothing it flat on the table with both hands, then said she had written something at home and asked if she could read it. They told her she could. She held the paper in both hands and began to read. And the handwriting wandered across the page, some words written over others, one place erased and written again. Reason number 1, she read. My sister knows I'm afraid of the dark, so she always leaves the door open a little. Not all the way, because if it's open all the way, it's too bright and I can't sleep. She leaves exactly 1 little space. Nobody told her to do that. She just knows. The girl looked down at the next line. Reason number 2. When Mom was sick, my sister left school to take care of her. People say that was a bad thing. I heard people say it. But I was there, and I saw that it was a good thing. She looked up briefly, then back down. Reason number 3. I have waited 327 days. I kept count. Then the girl turned the paper over. The back was covered with small pencil marks arranged in groups of 5, 1 row after another from the top edge almost all the way to the bottom, and in the lower right corner were the final 2 marks, darker and newer than the rest. She placed the paper on the table and pushed it toward the center, so all 3 adults could see it. I'm finished, she said. The social worker put down her pen. No one spoke for a while. Then the court representative asked whether Nell wanted to keep the paper, and Nell said she had written it to give to them, not to keep, so they could have it. That sheet of paper was entered into the case file, given an exhibit number, and it remains there to this day. The guardianship case was removed from suspension the following week after the court received all 3 documents. The first was Bernadette Ostrom's sworn statement. The second was the statement from the elderly retired mechanic. The third was an official notice from St. Coleman Hospital, 4 paragraphs long, confirming that after an internal review, the disciplinary finding involving student intern Marlowe Quinn had no basis that the submission date on the original report had been altered, and that the hospital was withdrawing the previous finding in full. The university restored her credits 3 weeks later and allowed her to complete the program with 1 additional semester of evening classes. The letter from St. Coleman arrived at the house by mail on a Friday afternoon. Marlowe opened it at the kitchen table. She read all 4 paragraphs. Then she read it again from the beginning, more slowly. She folded the paper in half, then into quarters, smoothed the crease with her thumb, stood, walked to the bottom drawer of the kitchen cabinet, opened it, and placed the letter beside Nell's birth certificate. She closed the drawer. Then she returned to her chair and sat there for a very long time without turning on the light, until the sky outside the window had gone completely dark. She didn't cry. She completed the additional semester in the fall and took her licensing examination in January. On her first morning, working under her new title, the clinic was as crowded as it was every Monday. She picked up the first patient's chart, stepped out from behind the desk, walked toward the waiting area, and spoke softly, just loudly enough for the person sitting there to hear. "Nurse Quinn will see you now," she said. In the row behind him, an old man in his 80s, who was waiting for a follow-up appointment, looked up. He looked at her, then he nodded once, only once, and lowered his eyes back to the newspaper resting in his lap. Nell came home on a Saturday in early February, nearly a year after that morning at the corner of Broad and Trinity. She carried a backpack and a hardbound dictionary with a peeling spine tucked under one arm the entire way because it wouldn't fit inside the bag. She walked into the kitchen, set the dictionary on the table, looked around once, then looked directly at the man standing by the sink. "Are you a bad man?" she asked. Marlowe was about to say something, but Sal dried his hands on a towel and turned around. "I used to be," he said. "Now I'm trying not to be anymore. Every day." Nell considered that answer with the seriousness of someone weighing a business proposal. "All right," she said. "I'll keep an eye on you." Then she asked where the dictionary ought to go, and Antonella said to leave it right on the dining table because people in this house argued about the meaning of words all the time. A few weeks later, on an ordinary afternoon, Antonella called Marlowe over and handed her the olive wood rosary. Marlowe said she couldn't accept it. Antonella placed it in her palm and closed Marlowe's fingers around it. "This belongs to the person who refused to let it go," she said, then took her cane and walked out into the garden without discussing it any further. It happened on a Sunday evening after Nell had gone upstairs, and the two of them were washing dishes. Sal handed her a plate, then went still, and the thumb of his right hand touched the hardened callus at the joint of his middle finger, rubbed it twice in a small circle, then stopped. "The day I brought you that envelope in the lot behind the church," he said, "I had a lot more than I have now." Marlowe didn't turn around. She kept rinsing the pot in the sink. "I think losing all of it was the best thing that ever happened to me," he said. She turned off the faucet. She dried her hands, turned around, and looked at him. "I've been waiting a long time for you to figure that out," she said. They married in April, in the backyard of a small church, with a little more than 30 people there. Antonella sat in the front row with her cane propped beside her chair. Nell was the bridesmaid, and had looked the word up in the dictionary to make sure she understood exactly what it meant. Beckwith sat beside Enzo. June arrived 10 minutes late, and took a seat at the edge of the third row. Wendell Pryor came with his wife, and Bernadette Ostrom drove down from Vermont the day before and sat in the very last row. The newspaper vendor from the corner of Broad and Trinity came too, wearing a suit jacket, and he was the first person to applaud. A year later, they opened the doorstep in the Riverside district, 2 blocks from the clinic. The center had 12 emergency beds for the coldest nights, a classroom where ordinary people could receive free training in first aid and emergency response, and a nursing scholarship fund for people who had once lived without stable housing. The first scholarship class accepted 19 people. On opening morning, the sky was clear and cold. Out front, Nell and another girl were arguing passionately about how high the sign should be hung. One insisted that if it went that high, pedestrians wouldn't see it. The other insisted that if it went that low, passing cars wouldn't see it because the trees would block the view. Sal walked past carrying a cardboard box and didn't interfere. He only slowed for half a second, then kept going. Marlowe stood in the doorway looking out, still holding the registration list in one hand, and she stayed there longer than she needed to. This story leaves us with a few very simple things. A person's dignity isn't determined by the address where they live, and sometimes the person with nothing in their hands is the only one who knows what needs to be done. There are prices we pay because we love someone, prices we don't regret, but we shouldn't let those prices define the rest of our lives. The greatest kindness isn't giving someone money. It is asking what they truly need, then becoming quiet enough to listen. And no one can wash their past clean. A person can only choose differently, every day, until choosing differently becomes who they are. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so we can keep listening together to more meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about Marlo and Salvatore? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the thoughts and feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish you good health, happiness, and peace in every day of your life. Goodbye for now, and we hope to see you again in the next video.